The singer-songwriter who's on the tip of everyone in the chattering class, at least in the United States and around its mouth right now, is a guy named Oliver Anthony. But before I can talk about Oliver Anthony, I want to talk about a much more famous, universally beloved musician who was Tom Petty. In 1985, Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers released an album called Southern Accents. And the opening track to that album is Rebels. It's a simple, infectious melody that hooks you in with searing guitars and organs and even trumpets. Petty sings with a pained whine that then becomes a defiant roar. The song is about a very drunk man being dramatically broken up with by his girlfriend, and then he tries to add some grandeur and meaning to his pain by saying he comes from a long line of suffering dating back to when the Confederates were defeated in the Civil War. Now, Petty has made clear the song is meant to be understood as a character study. It's not an endorsement of the character's perspective on the South and the Civil War. And look, I trust Tom Petty on this one. Insofar as he talks about politics, he appeared to be a progressive guy, and his keyboard player, Ben Montench, is definitely a progressive. But it's worth noting that Petty was able to write this character because he grew up in the South. You know, he says that earlier in his career, he wasn't bothered by Confederate flag imagery because in the South at the time, it was, in his words, just kind of like wallpaper. One didn't necessarily notice the sinister ideology behind it because it was just everywhere and just associated with southernness, etc. So this means when one listens to Rebels, certainly when one listens to Petty singing Rebels, and even when one thinks about the character in Rebels, one doesn't have to put the most sinister motives on the character. He's not necessarily identifying with the racist ideology of the Confederacy. Rather, the point of the song is he's just this angry, disoriented man just gripping for some symbol, for something to yell about, and it ends up being something that is quite uncomfortable for people who are not part of his subculture. So this brings me to the discourse about Oliver Anthony and Richmond North of Richmond. So to give you context, if you haven't seen the video, Richmond North of Richmond is by this previously unknown singer-songwriter Oliver Anthony, who's suddenly topping charts. You know, he performs it with just his big voice and his acoustic guitar. There's no fancy production. The only thing that gives it pizzazz is that Oliver Anthony has, I presume, naturally fiery hair and this giant beard. And it's a song about struggling working class people feeling misunderstood by the rich. Perhaps the emphasis is even more on politicians than the rich, if one thinks of Washington, D.C. as the first big locale north of Richmond, Virginia. And if one looks at the song of sees the working class rhetoric at all, one might think it's a left-wing song. But that would be to miss some of the cultural indicators that have switched in the United States since 2016, when we've seen Republicans with largely traditional conservative policy positions like Donald Trump, like Josh Hawley, trying to move away from the glorify the rich rhetoric of Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher to claiming they identify with the working class, even if that doesn't really make sense when it comes to their politics. And Richmond North of Richmond quickly became beloved by conservatives. The right-wing country singer John Rich offered to produce an album for Oliver Anthony, and it was brought up in a Republican presidential debate where the candidates were basically asked by Fox News to explain, why they identified with the message of the song. So how do I feel about this song? Well, it's not a song I would personally write, and the big thing that a lot of people on the left, myself included, are quite troubled by on the song is this point where it suddenly pivots to complaining about taxes being too high and tax money being spent on people on welfare and people on welfare spending their money on unhealthy food, specifically a kind of cookie called fudge rounds. And, it's ridiculous to imply that welfare and taxes are the reasons that poor Americans are struggling when there are all kinds of other far more expensive things, i.e. the military budget that Washington spends a ton on and might want to rethink. Another thing that really gets my goat is whenever conservative politicians talk about taxes, they always act like everyone just pays the same taxes. They conveniently ignore that tax systems tend to be progressive. So, no, it's not every person in the working class who's taxed to death. Ideally, the job of taxes is to take from people who are making the most money and take barely anything or nothing at all from people who are struggling to get by. Now, I get it, tax systems are imperfect. Income tax brackets don't necessarily recognize the nuances that billionaires are a lot richer than millionaires, millionaires are a lot richer than 100,000-aires. So, look, I would not have written the song Richmond North of Richmond. It's certainly not how I would frame my critique of capitalism and of income inequality. At the same time, I think it's a mistake of the left to just respond to the song in a political way. Billy Bragg, for instance, wrote a response song called Rich Men North of a Million, in which he borrows some of Anthony's words, but redirects the message to a better lesson of, don't complain about people on welfare, instead join a union and advocate for your own rights. And look, Billy Bragg is right when it comes to the message. But when it comes to the art of persuasion, I think it's important not to jump to telling people why they're wrong. I think you have to give their feelings a chance to settle. You have to, rather than directly going for the parts you dislike, maybe try and sympathize with the parts of the message you do like. Also, on an artistic level, Rich Men North of a Million clearly doesn't run off the tongue the way Rich Men North of Richmond does. And I think a mistake political songwriters sometimes make is they want to say their message so exactly they miss that what makes political song unique from political article writing or political sloganing is it's actually supposed to be artistic. And beyond that, I think what people miss when this character in the Oliver Anthony song complains about welfare is that it's kind of similar to the character in Tom Petty's Rebels. Namely, I think this character is saying something that is easy for him to say, but it's not necessarily a deep reflection of his beliefs. It's just as much a reflection of emotions of and frustration and not necessarily the ultimate political message. Oftentimes it's easier for us to imagine changing the things that are proximate to us. If you are a struggling poor person, yes, you might sometimes rant against elites, politicians, and business people, but you might feel you're powerless to change them. So maybe I'll redirect my anger at fellow poor people who I view as operating differently than me, and thus I can blame somehow for my suffering. It's just easier to let off steam at those people. If you look at the part of the song that's about welfare, it comes across as this bizarre tangent. It's this song singing vague platitudes about being screwed over by the bosses, and suddenly the singer fixates on this very specific gripe about people eating fudge rounds and spending all his money. Like it really comes across as a person who's, not all there. They suddenly get frustrated and they go on a tangent and start rambling. It's capturing a way that a certain kind of real person might express their anger rather than necessarily expressing the best kind of politics. Now, since I wrote my notes for this video, I'd like to add a slight addendum, which is apparently that Oliver Anthony on his Instagram directly addressed the fudge rounds thing. And he said his real point was that welfare as it is doesn't give poor people enough money to buy anything other than cheap food. So if you're investing tax money in a way where you're not actually allowing people to thrive, it's not a good thing. So he's kind of retroactively saying his lyrics could be interpreted even as saying we need to fund far more welfare, not far less. Now, that feels like a very charitable interpretation of his original lyrics, but you know what? If Oliver Anthony wants to change towards a more left-wing message, or he somehow feels like that was his message all along, I'm not one to complain. I think it's silly for people to say, well, we don't like your original song, so we're going to pretend the ideology you're coming up with now is not real. Like, clearly he's burning bridges with the people on the right who originally liked him. So good for him for saying more left-wing things. I do think another point that can't be ignored in the Oliver Anthony discourse, though, is I imagine lots of people who are casual musicians see this guy who's just a guy in his guitar getting a chart-topping hit and feeling inspired again. So often when we see artists coming out with their debut albums, it's clear they were coming out of the box with great production. It feels like there aren't talent scouts or, producers like Sam Phillips anymore who just hear people in their raw form. You don't see singers getting their first hit with a relatively low production acoustic track. It feels like stars are made, not discovered. And who knows how organic or not the origin stories of Oliver Anthony are. But to see this guy having success just because people like his song in this rawest form, there's something viscerally appealing about that to smaller musicians. So, anyway, basically, political debates should not just be about politics. And when one's doing art reviews, one has to also engage with them on an artistic level. So one has to think about politics, art, and emotions at the same time. Do I love the politics of Men North of Richmond? No. As an art critic, I think Richmond North of Richmond is a better lyric than Richmond North of a Million. And I think there are some interesting directions the flow of the lyrics take. And as someone applying emotional analysis, I would say, well, maybe some of the parts of this song that have less likable politics are recognizing the rougher side of the human condition, that when humans complain about their pain, they're not always going to be totally altruistic, totally reasonable, totally correct. And maybe the art we should enjoy won't always be the art that expresses the most pure politics, but has those uncomfortable nuances to it. So let me know your thoughts on the Richmond North of Richmond debate in the comments below, and any other songs it reminds you of, any songs you find intriguing despite not necessarily loving their politics. I'm Zach Morgenstern. This is Ludwig von B. See you next time.